Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we're going to be talking about the huge distraction that consumed both pilots for a full half hour just before they crashed a 737 off the coast of Hawaii in 2021. And this story is very relevant to GA pilots, so please stay tuned. Last week in episode 283, we talked about my recent helicopter check ride and what it would be like for you as a fixed-wing pilot to get a helicopter add-on rating. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/283. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, go to whatever app that you're using to listen to me and take a moment right now, find that subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, touch the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've ever learned something from this show that's helped you become a safer pilot or maybe even help pass a check ride, think about what you might pay for an hour of flight instruction and make a donation to help support the show. To do that, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up to make a regular monthly donation, or to make a one-time donation, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And of course, I've included those links in the episode description in the podcast app that you're listening to right now. Coming up in the news for the week of July 24th, 2023, Garmin has a new low-cost radar altimeter. You can now add complete electronic ignition to your aircraft. And the airlines have a surprising problem with their first officers. All this and more, and the news starts now. From Garmin.com, Garmin introduces new radar height advisor. Garmin has announced a small and lightweight height advisor called the GHA-15 that uses radar technology to provide height above the ground, or AGL, information on G3X touch flight displays for experimental aircraft. It's designed for experimental and light sport aircraft. And by the way, I just want to note that often new products are introduced first for experimental aircraft because of the less strenuous certification requirements. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a version of this for certified aircraft perhaps within the next year or two. Now, the GHA-15 calculates height AGL by sending radio waves to the ground and determining the time it takes to receive the signals back. It processes hundreds of measurements per second and applies advanced digital filters to maintain continuous readings even over water or in challenging terrain environments. AGL readouts are shown on the G3X touch display and drawn on the altitude tape at altitudes as high as 500 feet AGL. Using the readings provided by the GHA-15, the G3X touch flight displays can also provide AGL audio callouts via their audio output to help keep the pilot's eyes looking outside the cockpit. Beginning at 300 feet AGL, the pilot will hear audible AGL altitude callouts at select intervals down to 1 foot AGL. The pilot can configure the callouts to start and stop at specified altitudes. Knowing precise height AGL can be helpful to pilots during landings and flying in areas where limited barometric altimeter setting information is available, such as backcountry flying. The single module integrates all electronics into one compact unit that attaches to the bottom of the aircraft. Slightly larger than a deck of cards and weighing less than 1 pound, the height advisor requires minimal space and modification for installation on the aircraft. It'll become available in August 2023 with an expected street price of $1,995. For additional information, visit garmin.com/GHA-15. And I want to mention that a few years ago, I ran into a friend of mine with a seaplane, and he had a radar altimeter on it, and he used it for glassy water landings, where it's extremely difficult to determine your height above the water. From generalaviationnews.com, FAA approves SureFly dual electronic ignitions for certified aircraft. SureFlight Partners reported it has received an STC that permits the replacement of both mechanical magnetos on certified 4- and 6-cylinder Lycoming and Continental-powered aircraft with dual SureFly electronic ignitions. The STC allows the installation of 2 SureFly ignition modules, or SIMs, per engine on most piston engine aircraft. Jason Hutchinson, GM at SureFly Partners, said, quote, "Today is the culmination of years of working with the FAA to enable the replacement of both magnetos on certified aircraft. Aircraft owners, operators, manufacturers, and engine builders have been asking for an easy-to-install certified electronic magneto replacement for both magnetos, and today SureFly is the first to deliver a solution that is as simple as replacing both magnetos. More than 8,000 customers are already using a single SureFly SIM on their FAA-certified aircraft. The new approval permits the replacement of both magnetos, eliminating ignition maintenance as well as eliminating 500-hour magneto inspections, while improving starting and providing variable timing that can save an average of a gallon per hour for many aircraft owners. Installation is as simple as replacing a magneto with a simple addition of a power wire, company officials said. Owners of dual electrical bus aircraft can install 2 SIMs with no other additions. Owners of single electrical bus aircraft must provide a secondary source of power independent of the primary aircraft battery for the second SIM. SureFly SIMs are available for purchase at surefly.aero. Prices range from $1,755 to $2,085. From avweb.com, Diamond DA50RG earns FAA Type Certificate. Diamond Aircraft was presented with the FAA Type Certificate for its single-engine retractable gear DA50RG. Concurrently, Continental Aerospace announced it has received FAA-validated Type Certificate for its CD300 Jet A burning piston engine, which powers the model. The 5-seat Diamond DA50RG offers a top speed of 181 knots, 754 nautical mile range with 30-minute reserve, and a maximal useful load of 1,200 pounds. It comes equipped with a Garmin G1000 NXI flight deck and 3-blade MT hydraulic variable pitch propeller. The model flew for the first time in 2019 and made its AirVenture debut in 2021. Base price for the DA50RG is $1.15 million. And from the Diamond website, I've learned that they have a 25-city tour of the U.S. coming up in August and September so that you can see this airplane. And the website says that, quote, based on availability, limited demonstration flights are available to interested qualified buyers. From avweb.com, new FAA reauthorization bill would prohibit removing 100 low-lead from airports. The just-passed House FAA reauthorization bill would prevent airports from removing 100 low-lead or offering unleaded fuels in lieu of leaded avgas under penalty of losing airport improvement grants. If the language remains in the Senate version of the bill, it would raise a nearly insurmountable barrier to fielding competitive unleaded fuels because many airports can't afford or don't want dual tankage of both leaded and unleaded fuels. The bill requires any fuel being sold on October 5, 2018, the date of the previous reauthorization bill, to remain available to aircraft operators. George Brawley of GA Modifications Inc., or GAMI, the only U.S. company with an FAA-approved 100-octane fuel, said the bill will almost certainly stop dead early efforts to develop an unleaded market in California and other parts of the West. Quote, our position on the bill is that if it's adopted into law, it will be impossible for anyone, GAMI or Swift or anybody, to deliver a high-octane unleaded fuel, said Brawley. There's not enough money to put in additional tanks, and it would be years to get them installed. GAMI has been in discussions with several airports to replace 100 low-lead with its G100UL, retaining just one set of tanks. A previous amendment that would have further blocked G100UL required an industry-standard-approved fuel and was removed from the bill last week. Despite having STC approval for all spark ignition engines in the FAA database, distribution of G100UL has been problematic. Avfuel, which signed on to manufacture and distribute G100UL, has been making little progress in marketing it, according to GAMI. The House version of the bill now goes to the Senate, where similar language would allow unleaded fuels to replace 100 low-lead when the former is, quote, widely available. That determination would be made by the Secretary of Transportation. And the article provides some additional information at the bottom and says the Office of California Representative Jay Obernolte, which drafted amendments to the 2023 reauthorization bill, said that the intent of the language was to allow fleet-wide adoption of unleaded fuel without requiring STCs. Quote, nothing in Section 431 prohibits an airport from offering an unleaded fuel or even exclusively offering an unleaded fuel. They just can't stop selling 100 low-lead until there is an unleaded alternative that can be used by all aircraft requiring avgas, said Obernolte's communication director. The amendment specifically included obtaining a, quote, industry consensus standard, as that would allow fleet-wide adoption without the need for STCs, she added. GAMI's G100UL is approved for all spark ignition engines in the FAA database via STC, but it does not have a consensus standard from ASTM as 100 low-lead does. There are currently no 100-octane unleaded aviation gasolines with ASTM approval. The industry's Eagle initiative has set 2030 as the deadline for reaching that goal. GAMI's Brawley says the bill, if passed, is still a potential showstopper. He argues that G100UL's testing was reviewed by 2 separate FAA boards and that these reviews are the functional equivalent of an ASTM evaluation. GAMI initially submitted its fuel for ASTM approval, but Brawley said delays and misappropriation of intellectual property led them to withdraw the application. From Patch.com, cause of fatal French Valley, California airport crash revealed. A single-engine airplane with a licensed pilot at the controls, flying with his young sons, stalled, rolled, inverted, and then crashed next to a building during a touch-and-go landing at French Valley Airport, killing the airmen and severely injuring the boys, according to federal investigators. The NTSB released its preliminary report on the July 4th crash that killed the 39-year-old and left his sons with major injuries. According to the NTSB's initial findings, the pilot was flying the Cessna 172N in the pattern at French Valley just before 2 p.m. on the holiday and was performing what appeared to be a touch-and-go on runway 18 when he apparently lost control. The airplane touched down on the runway for 1 to 2 seconds and then immediately entered a climb in a nose-high attitude as it drifted left of the runway, the NTSB said. After the airplane reached about 60 feet above ground level, it began to settle and subsequently entered a left-wing low attitude. The airplane rolled inverted and then crashed into an industrial complex. Investigators relied on an airport surveillance camera and eyewitnesses to gather preliminary data on the accident. A witness said he observed the entire chain of events, noting that as the Cessna approached runway 18, it was unstable. Quote, after the airplane made contact with the runway, the witness heard the engine power advance and observed the aircraft taking off again. The plane then veered off the side of the runway. According to the witness, the plane was still configured with full flaps as it slowly climbed toward a group of buildings. Its wings rocked back and forth, and the flaps started to retract. The Cessna went down roughly a third of a mile from the runway, with the wing making contact with a 50-foot building, leaving strike marks as the plane crashed upside down. Riverside County Sheriff's deputies were first to reach the location and discover the pilot dead in the cockpit. Paramedics arrived minutes later and rendered treatment to the 3 boys. FAA records indicate that the pilot obtained his student pilot certificate in September 2020, but did not have a private pilot certificate. However, according to Stephanie Bowden, manager of business operations for EFI Flight School / California Professional Flyers, the pilot was newly licensed to fly on June 19th, making him legally authorized to carry passengers. The Cessna, tail number November 5243 Echo, belonged to California Flyers Club at the French Valley Airport, according to the FAA records. And I'd just like to note that this particular Cessna model had the older flap version that could be extended to 40 degrees versus the current 172 versions, which can only extend their flaps to 30 degrees. And it's worth noting that there have been numerous accidents in the past in which pilots crashed after doing a go-around or touch-and-go when they forgot to retract the flaps from 40 to 20 degrees. And it's likely that those accidents led Cessna to changing the aircraft so that the flaps could only be extended to 30 degrees. That way, if you forget to raise the flaps to 20 degrees during a go-around, you have a much better chance of getting at least some climb capability out of the aircraft. So please practice go-arounds in whatever aircraft you fly. Some pilots go years without practicing a go-around and then bungle it when they do have to go around. And here's another related story that came out about the same time. This comes from GeneralAviationNews.com. Pilots who meet at fly-in crash Cessna 150. This comes from an NTSB report. According to the Cessna 150's owner, he and the other pilot met at an aviation event just before the accident. After a short discussion, the 2 pilots decided to conduct a local flight in the 150. The owner, who was seated in the left seat, stated that the airplane's engine needed to be hand-propped due to a starter that, quote, wasn't very powerful. After the engine startup, the pilots monitored the airplane's electrical system and performed an engine run-up with no issues noted. After takeoff from the airport in Rock Falls, Illinois, while on the downwind leg of the traffic pattern, the right seat pilot asked to take the airplane's control from the left seat pilot, and a positive exchange of controls was accomplished. The right seat pilot then flew a low approach over a temporary grass runway with 40 degrees of flaps extended. The right seat pilot did not intend to land and performed a go-around about 100 feet above the ground with full engine power and carburetor heat in the off position. The right seat pilot then attempted to retract the flaps, however the flaps would not retract. The left seat pilot attempted to cycle the flap switch and was unsuccessful in retracting the flaps. Unable to maintain altitude, the right seat pilot performed an off-airport landing to a cornfield. The airplane hit the cornfield, flipped over, and came to rest inverted. According to an FAA inspector, the airplane sustained substantial damage to the engine firewall and engine mount. The inspector also noted a 4-port USB power supply adapter was plugged into a power port just below the flap switch. A review of the airplane's logbooks revealed that the airplane had been assembled, inspected, and reassembled. All work was completed in July of 2014. Part of the aircraft reassembly included the replacement of the instrument panel and some aircraft wiring. The flap switch was relocated from its original position and was also changed to a new flap switch design. A circuit breaker had been installed in the flap wiring, which replaced the original fuse. A cigarette-style power port was installed just below the flap handle. Post-accident examination of the airplane revealed that the flaps were in the full-down or 40-degree extended position. The flap system was tested multiple times. The flaps retracted and extended with a cockpit flap switch, and no anomalies were noted with the function of the flap system. At some point after the FAA's initial examination of the airplane, the 4-port USB power supply adapter had been removed from the power port and was located in the aft baggage area. According to the Cessna Owner's Manual, Section 2, Flap Settings, normal and obstacle clearance takeoffs are performed with flaps up. Flap deflections of 30 and 40 degrees are not recommended at any time for takeoff. In a balked landing, go-around climb, the wing flap setting should be reduced to 20 degrees immediately after full power is applied. Upon reaching a safe altitude, the flap should be slowly retracted to the full-up position. Probable cause: the right seat pilot's improper decision to perform a low approach with full flaps and the failure of the flaps to retract during the attempted go-around, which resulted in a forced landing. From Gizmodo.com, the FAA is using virtual reality simulators to test helicopter safety. The FAA says it's experimenting with a pair of virtual reality or VR helicopter training simulators to conduct safety research. An FAA spokesperson told Gizmodo it recently installed 2 simulators developed by the Swiss startup Loft Dynamics in the William Hughes Technical Center in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The simulators are designed to mimic the experience and conditions pilots feel in an Airbus H125 and Robinson R22. Safety experts using the simulators, the spokesperson added, will use them to virtually explore a variety of dangerous helicopter hazards that frequently lead to real-world accidents. Quote, the Airbus H125 and Robinson R22 simulators are VR technology to conduct crucial safety research using situations that cause frequent helicopter accidents. The FAA spokesperson told Gizmodo, quote, the Airbus H125 and Robinson R22 simulators use virtual reality technology to conduct crucial safety research using situations that cause frequent helicopter accidents. These include loss of control in flight and during takeoff, abrupt maneuvers, entry into low visibility and nighttime conditions, spatial disorientation, wire strikes, and bird strikes. From avweb.com, China plans electric airliner using new battery technology. And this is about solid-state battery technology, which we talked about last week in a story from Toyota. It says, China is moving ahead with an electric aircraft program, and it may have a leg up on the competition because of an emerging battery design. Although they haven't come up with a production model, contemporary Amperex technology company Ltd., a huge EV battery maker, claims to have been working on a solid-state battery that stores up to 500 watt-hours per kilogram. That's roughly twice the density of the best available batteries currently in production. A joint venture between the battery developer, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, and Shanghai University aims to harness all that power and perhaps develop a viable electric airliner. The initial budget for the research work is about $80 million. No timelines have been set. And finally, from BusinessInsider.com, pilots don't want to be promoted to captain anymore, and it's become a huge problem for the airlines. Pilots are turning down promotions to become captains, and this could end up being a huge headache for airlines that are only just emerging from a pandemic slump. Despite the lure of a bigger paycheck, multiple United Airlines pilots, analysts, and union officials told Reuters in a report published July 19th that pilots were shunning captaincies due to unpredictable flying schedules. Phil Anderson, a first officer with United, told the outlet that if he took up the promotion, he, quote, would have ended up divorced and seeing my kids every other weekend. United failed to fill 978 captain vacancies in the past year, or around 50% of all vacancies posted by the airlines, Reuters reported, citing data from the United Pilot Union. In June alone, 96 of the 198 openings for captain positions remained vacant. Scott Kirby, the CEO of United, confirmed the reporting, saying of the company's earnings call, it's been the first time that I've ever known it to happen in the airline industry. It's going to impact capacity in the fourth quarter. With fewer captains, airlines could struggle to maintain their flight capacity, leading to potential disruptions in service. And United is not alone in facing this problem. Over 7,000 pilots declined to take up captaincies at American Airlines, Reuters reported, citing data from the airlines union. The number of pilots declining promotions had doubled in the past 7 years, a spokesman for the American Airlines Pilot Union told the news outlet. Airlines in the U.S. are already struggling to have sufficient pilots to fly existing routes, with around 18,000 fewer commercial pilots than the industry needs in 2023. airlines have already ramped up pay and resorted to increasingly hiring from abroad to fill the gap. According to IATA's most recent available data, global plane passenger loads are returning to pre-pandemic levels, with air traffic up 31% in May compared to the same period a year ago. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and later we'll talk about the crash of a 737 in Hawaii and what preceded that crash. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now for a few updates, and I'm going to keep this quick because within a few hours I have to dash out to the venue for my daughter's wedding this weekend, so that should be great fun. Anyway, the good news department, Malcolm Jack, congratulations to you on your instrument rating. He says, thanks, Max. I love your podcast, and I think it was instrumental in helping me to pass my instrument check right in July. You've definitely made me a safer pilot as I take ideas from your podcast and apply them to my flying. Thanks so much, Malcolm. And I want to follow up on something I mentioned in episode 283, which is that Cessna recently issued hot weather operations supplements for the Cessna 182 TPOH. And I want to thank two of our listeners who contacted me with information on where to find two additional hot weather supplements for the Cessna 172 and the Cessna T206H. And I have now posted those online as well, too. So take a look in our show notes for a link. And all three of those supplements are posted on the same page on the Patreon website, and that is available to anyone. You don't have to be a Patreon member to access that and download those hot weather supplements. Though while you're there, if you like, go ahead and click on the blue button to the right, which lets you sign up to become a member to support the show. And if you are listening to us right now on the Stitcher app, and that would be a little bit less than 1% of you, that app is going to be shutting down on August 29th, 2023, which means you'll no longer be able to hear this podcast. So I want to encourage you sometime soon to go out and find a replacement app because Stitcher is going away. And if you want, go out to aviationnewstalk.com and you'll find a list of apps in the right column of the page that you can download and use as a substitute now that Stitcher is going away. And I'm very excited to announce that I have got something new that I worked long and hard on that a few of you had suggested. And that is, I now have a complete index of all of the Aviation News Talk episodes. And you can go out to our Patreon site and download that for free. Again, don't have to be a Patreon supporter. It's a 10-page PDF. Basically, I've indexed all the topics that we've talked about for the last 6.5 years here on the show. And it's just an easy way, for example, to find out, let's see if I look up IFR here. What do we have under IFR? Long list. So, for example, advisory glide slopes talked about in the episode 233. Approach plate minimums explained in episode 100. How to brief the approach, episode 34. And it goes on and on and on for 10 pages. Often I get emails from people saying, hey, I remember hearing a show about icing. Which episode was that? Well, if you download the index, it's going to be pretty easy to find out that, looks like we had about 4 episodes on icing, including a discussion of an accident in episode 220, how to avoid or escape icing in 110, my near-fatal icing accident in 227, and an SR20 accident in episode 111. So check it out. There's going to be a link for it in the show notes. And the easy way to do it, if you are on the web, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/index, and it will take you directly to that page. And I'll plan to update this a couple of times a year. And now let me talk very briefly about our Patreon supporters. Just 2 new supporters in the past week. Thanks so much to Chris Galarte, signed up at the $8 a month level. And special thanks to Don Dillman, who has edited his pledge from $8 a month back up to $50 a month and becomes one of our mega supporters once again. We've had a number of people drop out recently who've had some financial issues, which I totally understand. I've certainly had those from time to time in the past. So if you do find yourself needing to drop out, that's perfectly fine. On the other hand, if you are doing well and you'd like to support the show, please consider going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and signing up to support the show on a monthly basis. We also had a one-time donation via PayPal. Special thanks to Patrick Wiggins, who's contributed multiple times in the past for donating $50. If you'd like to make a one-time donation as Patrick did, just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, we're going to talk about that surprising 737 accident that happened off the coast of Hawaii 2 years ago. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Today we're going to talk about an accident that's relevant to us as GA pilots and about the surprising factors involved with a 737 that crashed into the ocean at night just offshore from the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The final NTSB report came out recently, and you may have heard about the crash, but there's an important element of the crash that didn't make it into the final NTSB report and hence was not included in any of the media coverage I saw. But one author who focuses on writing accident reports dug out this information, and I'm indebted to her for finding it. She writes under the name of Admiral Cloudbird on medium.com, and that website recommended the article to me, which is how I came across it. Now, I'll just be reading a portion of her article, which I've edited for time and to remove the names of the various pilots involved. But I have included a link to it in our show notes, and you can go there to read the full article and see the many photos she's included. And if you're interested in airliner accidents, which is the accident type she focuses on, you may want to follow Admiral Cloudbird on medium.com and Twitter, or contribute to her via Patreon. Reading from the article, on the 2nd of July 2021, a Boeing 737-200 hauling cargo between the Hawaiian Islands lost power in one engine shortly after takeoff from Honolulu. As the pilots attempted to turn back toward the airport, they reported the unthinkable. Their second engine was going too, and they weren't going to make it. The crew carried out an extraordinary ditching at sea in the dark of night, successfully bringing their 737 down in the ocean about 2 miles from shore. Although the plane broke into two pieces on impact, both pilots managed to escape and were plucked from the water. 2 years later, the NTSB's final report has confirmed what many long suspected, that the crash of Transair Flight 810 was not a story of exemplary airmanship, but quite the opposite, as a relatively minor engine failure snowballed into a dangerous ditching that need never have been attempted. The unfortunate truth was that the pilots never properly addressed the emergency, and in their confusion, reduced power on their functioning engine. The cockpit voice recordings and interview with the pilots reveal the factors which may or may not have contributed, from their muddled attempts to declare an emergency to an incomplete control handover to simple stress, as the pilot delivered a heated and sometimes sexist 32-minute pre-flight monologue about a fellow pilot. In any case, the findings raised questions about the safety culture at Transair, a scrappy and now defunct cargo airline operating 50-year-old airplanes, and highlighted how a breakdown in communication and critical thinking can turn a minor failure into a potentially deadly crash. Just after midnight on July 2, 2021, the captain reported for duty at Honolulu International to fly Transair Flight 810, a regular service from Hawaii's capital to the island of Maui. Joining him was a 50-year-old first officer who was the founder of a local law firm. He first flew for commuter carrier Mesa Airlines from 1991 to 95 before switching careers to become a divorce lawyer. In 2019, however, he decided to get back into flying, and for the last 2 years he had been splitting his time between Transair and his legal practice. That night they would be flying a Boeing 737-200 built in 1975 and registered as November 810 Tango Alpha, and at Transair the flight number was based on the registration number. Any route that November 810 Tango Alpha happened to be flying was Flight 810. When they arrived at the ramp, cargo handlers were loading the plane with several tons of frozen seafood, pharmaceuticals, and other perishable items typically shipped by air in Hawaii. After performing the pre-flight checks, pilots sat down in the cockpit to wait for the cargo loading to finish, at which point the captain began to vent about an incident that had allegedly occurred on July 1st, less than 24 hours before. The first officer appeared to have been already aware of what happened, suggesting that the conversation may actually have begun earlier, but what is known is that the issue would come to dominate the cockpit conversation almost until the moment of takeoff. And let me just interject for a second here. This is one of the more interesting aspects of this accident, which is not mentioned at all in the NTSB's 45-page final report. To find this information, one has to go into the docket, which is a collection of documents and reports associated with the accident. The writer found this information in the cockpit recorder transcript, which I'll read from later. Getting back to the article, most of the information about what happened comes from the captain's own statements captured by the cockpit voice recorder, but what is known is that on the morning of the 1st, the captain had been rostered to fly with the airline's sole female first officer. After a fraught disagreement over procedures, the two apparently found themselves in a shouting match in the cockpit, at which point she announced that she would not fly with the captain and walked away from the flight in the middle of the after-start checklist. A new first officer had to be found and the flight was delayed. From the transcript, the captain clearly had not mentally moved on from the incident. The conflict seemed to have arisen because the captain and the lady first officer had different interpretations of the procedures in the manual, and neither was willing to compromise with the other, a hallmark of poor crew resource management. As the first officer listened, interjecting only occasionally to affirm his captain, the captain described his interpretation of the procedures, then discussed how she walked out in the middle of the checklist, which apparently prompted him to say a number of hostile words, including, "What's wrong with you? This is a joke, and you're going to finish the checklist." A shouting match ensued, which the first officer recognized as a safety issue, though neither pilot pointed out the captain's own role in the altercation. In fact, he said, quote, "This is the way we work when I'm with her, you know. You have to yell at her to force her to do things." This incident had apparently been escalated all the way to the airline's owner. The captain then professed a belief that first officers need to acquiesce to their captains, regardless of what they thought the book said. Again, not a hallmark of an effective team player. Now, interjecting again, that's most of what this article says about that aspect of the flight, but I wanted to know more about it. So I searched for and found the cockpit recorder transcript. Here's what I learned. The transcript starts at 12:39 a.m., so a little after midnight. During the next 2 minutes, little is said except the crew can be heard getting their clearance and reading it back. For the next 2 minutes, mostly sounds were recorded in the cockpit. 4 minutes after the transcript begins, we hear the first real conversation among the pilots, and it's the captain talking about his encounter with a female first officer the day before. And that conversation goes on for 13 minutes until a ground crew member says hello at 12:57 a.m., asking for a signature on a load form. The crew member leaves a minute later, and the captain immediately continues with his complaints about the female first officer for another 9 minutes. The captain then launches into a story about icing and taking off from New York in the middle of the winter, and how that's relating to checking the controls, which, by the way, seemed to be the main issue of contention between the two pilots as to how the yoke should be moved to properly check the controls. 4 minutes later, he starts talking again about the female first officer. They then listen to the ATIS, and the captain continues again talking about that first officer, saying, "Yeah, well, I hope she doesn't get fired. I hope they talk to her and she changes her ways." Later he says, "Yeah, that I give to her, but common sense is not there. You cannot tell her what to do, you know. Lately, her ego has become very big. It's getting bigger and bigger, you know. And I told somebody whose name is removed here, hey, I go something with her fly. He goes, she is getting set in her ways." First officer replies, "If the owner really is like having a meeting with her, then that should be the end of it. That or she will get fired next time. I mean, if there is a next time, I don't know." It's now 1:14 a.m., 30 minutes after the captain first started talking about the female flight officer. During that time, they spent a minute talking to the ground crew and a minute picking up the ATIS. All of the rest of the time was the captain complaining to the first officer about his issue with his first officer on the night before. It's now just 9 minutes before they'll call for taxi, and all of that 9 minutes is spent running checklist and doing a before takeoff briefing. 4 minutes into the taxi, the captain starts up again, saying, quote, these are the kind of women you don't want to get married to. You know, some men, they lose their temper, and the next thing you know, the wife is dead, you know. They start punching them and kicking them, and they lost their minds, you know. They kill the woman. It's the woman who can drive you to doom. Crazy stuff, you know. And that conversation continues right up to the time the flight is cleared for takeoff. Now, FAR 121.452, often referred to as the sterile cockpit rule, reads in Part A, no certificate holder shall require nor may any flight crew member perform any duties during a critical phase of flight except those duties required for the safe operation of the aircraft. And skipping down to C, it says for the purposes of this section, critical phases of flight include all ground operations involving taxi, takeoff, and landing, and all other flight operations conducted below 10,000 feet except for cruise flight. So the half hour the captain spent complaining before they started taxiing didn't violate the sterile cockpit rule, though it did indicate how wound up the captain was about this incident. However, the several minutes he spent talking about it during their 9-minute taxi clearly did violate the sterile cockpit rule. Regardless, the cockpit recorder transcript paints a picture of a captain who, 24 hours later, was clearly distracted by the events of the prior day. In fact, I counted. The word "she" is used 75 times by the pilot and co-pilot as they discuss the incident. Now, getting back to the article, it says, as the 737 accelerated down the runway, the captain made the standard call-out, 80 knots, followed by V1, or decision speed, and then rotate. The first officer pulled the nose back and the plane lifted off, prompting the captain to call out positive rate. Gear up, said the first officer, and the captain complied. Then, just as the gear finished retracting, a loud thud was heard, accompanied by vibrations, and a long whooshing sound like an engine rolling back. Oh crap, the first officer explained. Lost an engine. You got it? The captain asked. Okay, I got it. Yep, the first officer said, instinctively stepping on the rudder to counteract the developing asymmetric thrust. Yep, you lost number, the captain started to say, trying to determine which engine had failed. Number 2, yep, the first officer replied, referring to the right engine. Number 2, the captain agreed. Now, here's a key point in the article coming up. The pilot's initial assessment was correct. Inside the high-pressure turbine within the right engine, corrosion had been eating away at 2 of the turbine blades from the inside. The corrosion steadily weakened the blades until one or both failed under the stresses of normal operation. The broken blade tips were then sucked back through the low-pressure turbine, causing further damage that reduced the engine's ability to produce power. In fact, within seconds of the failure, the engine pressure ratio, or EPR for the right engine, a proxy for its power output, decreased from 1.97, which is approximately takeoff power, to 1.43, which is closer to cruise power. When an engine failure occurs on takeoff in a twin-engine jet like the 737, the procedure is to declare an emergency, climb to a safe altitude, level off, identify which engine has failed, complete the engine failure or shutdown checklist, and then return to the airport. Therefore, to start things off, the captain jumped on the radio and said, "Roads 810, we have an emergency, stand by." Returning his attention to the cockpit, the captain now said, "You want me to take over or you got it?" "No, I'm okay, thank you," said the first officer. In an emergency, it's normal for the first officer to fly while the captain develops a strategy and completes the abnormal checklist. This was not an official rule, nor was it set in stone, but the captain's offer contradicted it nonetheless. At that moment, the controller called again. Roads Express 810, when you get a chance, can I get the nature of the emergency? I know you said an engine out. Which one? How many souls on board and fuel? Okay, all that is good. We'll give you all that in a little bit. Roads 810, the captain replied. Turning back to the first officer, he said, okay, so we'll plan for 220 speed, eh? Okay, said the first officer. By now, both thrust levers had been rolled all the way back to flight idle, the lowest flight setting, and the left and right EPRs had dropped to 1.05 and 1.09 respectively, indicating very little forward thrust. Their speed was dropping nicely toward 220 knots, which was what they wanted. Now, about 45 seconds after his first offer to take control, the captain said, "Let me take over briefly, and you—" "Okay," the first officer agreed. He would later state that he perceived the captain's statement as an order, so he agreed to hand over control, even though he was having no issues with the plane. In fact, with both engines at idle, the asymmetric thrust had disappeared, and it was trivial to keep the plane straight and level. Now that he was flying the airplane, the captain immediately noticed that all was not as it should be. Their speed had dropped to the target of 220 knots, but they were losing altitude, having fallen from 2,100 feet down to 1,700 feet. The captain tried pitching up to regain their plane altitude, but as a result, their speed dropped even more to 196 knots, and the plane barely climbed. Of course, the reason was because the first officer had set both thrust levers to idle, and because of the control handover, no one pushed them back up again. But the captain didn't realize that. Instead, he said, okay, let's see what is the problem. Which one, what's going on with the gauges? Read the gauges and see which one, who won, who has the EGT. Glancing over at the engine gauges, the first officer attempted to determine which engine had abnormal parameters, including but not limited to the exhaust gas temperature, or EGT. But with both engines still running at idle power, it was difficult to tell. Out of the indicated parameters, engine pressure ratio, or EPR, was usually the biggest clue, but the EPR for both engines was almost the same. Instead, the first officer attempted to recall which symptoms he had noticed when the engine first failed. He heard a sound which seemed to come from the left, and the plane yawed left, didn't it? So it must have been the left engine. Its indicated EPR, slightly below that of the right engine, was consistent with such an interpretation. And so he said, yep, so it looks like the number 1. Number 1 is gone, the captain asked. It's gone, yep, said the first officer. So we have number 2. So we have number 2, okay, said the captain. But remember that when the failure first happened, both pilots identified the problem as being with the right engine. The first officer even used the rudder to prevent the airplane from yawing right. But in the intervening 4 minutes, both pilots had somehow entirely forgotten their initial impressions. The first officer even seemingly forgot that the left engine was at idle power, even though he put it there himself just 2 minutes earlier. Having concluded that the left engine was at fault, the captain advanced the right thrust lever in order to stabilize their flight path, then moved to their next priority, completing the engine failure checklist. His plan was to fly 15 miles away from the airport on their assigned heading before turning back, which would give them plenty of time to complete the procedure. So he said, all right, 240 heading, I have control. Okay, should we head back toward the airport, though, before we get too far away? Yeah, we'll stay within 15. All right, I have controls. You're on the checklist. Let's do the engine failure shutdown checklist. The first officer would later assert that he disagreed with the decision to spend so much time in the air, but that the captain was the captain, so he obeyed him. Besides, given their earlier conversation, he surely knew where arguing with the captain would get him, which was nowhere. The captain, for his part, would later note that he had been reprimanded by the chief pilot for landing without performing the checklist after a prior engine failure and had promised not to do so again. Some 30 seconds later, the captain asked ATC for permission to begin turning in and received a new heading. Meanwhile, the first officer started reading off the conditions for performing the checklist. Okay, engine failure or shutdown, he recited. When these occur, engine failure, engine flameout, or another checklist directs an engine failure. At that moment, the first officer seemed to notice that the EGT in the right engine was abnormally high, almost inside the red warning zone on the gauge. If they let the exhaust gas temperature climb into the red zone, severe engine damage could occur. Of course, the reason for this was the right engine was already damaged and was not running properly, causing its internal temperature to rise. But in the moment, it appeared to the first officer that they were simply demanding too much of the old, somewhat underpowered engine. We're redline here. We should pull the right one back a bit, he said. The captain immediately recognized that this was a serious issue. He had already moved the right thrust lever to a reasonable power setting, but the EPR was much lower than it should have been, only 1.22, which was not enough to keep them airborne for long. And yet, even at this low power setting, the engine was overheating. His immediate conclusion was that they were about to lose thrust in both engines and that they needed to get on the ground as soon as possible. So he said, okay, shoot, we should head toward the airport. As the gravity of the situation set in, the first officer began setting up for the approach while the captain informed ATC that they were turning in and did not have the airport in sight. By now they had sunk down to 1,000 feet. Their speed was down to 157 knots, and both parameters were still decreasing. Damn, the captain said. Suddenly the stick shaker activated, warning that they were flying too slowly and could stall if they didn't increase their airspeed. With their only working engine redlined, or so they thought, the only way to gain airspeed was by pitching down, but that would only hasten their already alarming descent. What's this? The captain exclaimed. Hey man, we can't keep going down. We're descending, the first officer agreed. The captain advanced the right thrust lever even more, and the EPR crept up to a still meager 1.37, but the temperature only continued rising into the red zone until finally it reached the maximum the gauge could indicate. Okay, see if you can see the airport now, the captain said, growing worried. We're descending, we have to climb, said the first officer. Double check the airplane is cleaned up, said the captain. Yeah, flaps are up, speed brakes, the first officer replied. How is the EGT, the captain asked. It's max, it's beyond max, said the first officer. Okay, we're barely holding altitude, the captain said. Okay, see what you can do in the checklist. Finish as much as possible. 15 miles out, the captain said. They were on their way back to the airport now, but they were so low that it was difficult to make out the airport lights on the horizon, and they were still dropping. Unless they managed to find some more thrust, they weren't going to make it. Of course, if either of them had simply advanced the left thrust lever, all their problems would have been solved, but nobody even thought to try, so down they went. Keying his microphone, the captain said to ATC, Okay, Rhodes 810, situation, we've lost number one engine, and we're going straight to the airport. We're going to need the fire department. There's a chance we're going to lose the other engine too. It's running very hot. And speed is, we're pretty low on the speed, and it doesn't look good out here. You might want to let the Coast Guard know as well. This request would probably end up being the best decision the captain made during the entire emergency. As Flight 810 dropped the last few hundred feet toward the ocean, the warnings continued to blare. Too low, terrain, 300, too low, gear. Rhodes Express 810, the trucks are rolling, said the controller. Jumping on the radio again, the captain replied, "Roger, you wanna let the Coast Guard know as well?" "Say that again." "Can you let the Coast Guard know we cannot maintain altitude?" the captain repeated. "We will," said the controller. The impact was hard and over quickly. Within seconds, the plane ground to a halt, but its fuselage had cracked in two just ahead of the wings and water was pouring in. By the time the captain managed to undo his seatbelt, the water outside the plane was halfway up his window and came rushing into the cockpit when he slid it open. Fighting against the inflow, he managed his way out the window and into the heaving ocean. Meanwhile, the first officer's seat had collapsed forward on impact, causing him to strike his head, but he too managed to open his window and climb out. In search of something to hang on to, the captain swam toward the tail section, but no cargo or panels had come loose, so he simply grabbed the ADF antenna on the vertical stabilizer and hauled himself onto the top of the sinking empennage, where he clung to the tail as waves crashed over him. At the same time, the first officer held onto the nose section, but as it began to slip beneath the surface, he spotted a loose cargo pallet and climbed aboard using it as a makeshift raft. He called his captain's name, and the captain called his name in return, but the captain was in trouble as waves repeatedly knocked him off his perch, forcing him to swim back again. Suddenly, the roar of a helicopter overcame the rumble of the waves, and floodlights illuminated the desperate scene. The Coast Guard had arrived. Against all odds, having ditched their plane in the ocean in the middle of the night, both pilots had been saved in the nick of time. When NTSB investigators arrived in Hawaii later that day, they knew from the publicly available ATC tapes that the pilots of Flight 810 reported an inability to maintain altitude and a possible dual engine failure, leading to a forced landing on a water at night. It was clear that the pilots were lucky to be alive. In fact, both were released from hospital within 48 hours. And now let's switch gears and take a look at the NTSB's final report. At the bottom of the report, it says probable cause: the flight crew members' misidentification of the damaged engine after leveling off the airplane and reducing thrust, and their use of only the damaged engine for thrust during the remainder of the flight, resulting in an unintentional descent and forced ditching in the Pacific Ocean. Contributing to the accident were the flight crew's ineffective crew resource management, high workload, and stress. So this is yet another case of a crew that's mismanaged an emergency and pulled back the power on a good engine while trying to stay in the air with the bad engine. If you fly multi-engine aircraft, or if you think you may do that in the future, you'll want to be particularly aware that even pilots with thousands of hours of flight experience sometimes make this mistake. Now, the final report says this was a Part 121 cargo flight, but oddly, the report makes no mention of the captain's failure to follow the sterile cockpit rules during taxi. So while this was an airliner accident, I think there's a lot that all of us as GA pilots can learn from it. And if you have any feedback or insight about this episode or anything else you'd like to share, please go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and send me an email, and I'll read some of your emails on a future show. And if you've been learning things from this show, well, please consider signing up to become a member and help support the show. It's easy to join the club and become a member. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, choose the dollar amount you'd like to pledge to support the show each month, and at the same time, you can read about the things you get at the different dollar levels. Or you can make a one-time donation at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And thanks to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.